Okay. Here we come. So yes, then good afternoon, or well, actually, hello everybody, because it's not afternoon everywhere. That's the other thing we get used to. And yes, a very warm welcome, even though just online, of course, but a very warm welcome to this lecture. But also before we go to this lecture, to this whole lecture series, as some of you may have seen, this is the beginning of a new lecture series that we have planned and thought about for a while. Obviously, there are many online lecture series now, and there are also many that focus on the topics around technology and translation and interpreting that we want to focus on. So I'm not claiming that we are inventing something entirely new here. I just wanted to say, I mean, so why are we adding our own series? Then basically, as some of you know, we have a research program running here in the Center for Translation Studies in Surrey that focuses very much on this question about how human and machine can be better integrated in translation and interpreting. And of course, the starting point is technology and the general excitement that comes with the use of technology. And in the pandemic, clearly, without technology, we wouldn't have been where we are. And this here also is a good example of the benefits that it can have. But as you all know, the benefits are not all there is. There are many questions that the impact, I should say, of technology use raises in our discipline. And I'm focusing on our discipline. Of course, this goes through the whole of the professional world, but let's stick with our discipline. So the impact of this, it's also not, it's of course not a new phenomenon. It applies to the more established technologies, from distance communication technologies to digital platforms, what have you. But of course, now we have technologies that are more data-driven, that pretend at least to create human parity. So the questions have shifted, but there are also questions that apply to a whole range of technologies, and they apply to translation, interpreting, and many forms in between, because that's also an interesting phenomenon that we see more and more of these hybrid forms of language mediation happening. And so this is the background that we would like to take a very open approach to, if you like, critically appraising what is happening there. I think I think also our job as academics and as researchers to sort of critically observe what is happening, to critically engage with this, to also openly contribute to potential solutions, to viable solutions, of course, to sustainable solutions. I think that is the emphasis here. So by looking at all the impacts, not just at this question, does it work or not, but by looking also at the more long-term impacts. I mean, one thing is quality, of course, but it's also the well-being of the people who are using these technologies, of the people who are supposed to be at the receiving end of these technologies. So all these questions are very important for us. And this is why in this particular lecture series, what we would like to do is to bring together guest lecturers who can talk specifically on, if you like, this wide range of implications, the social, the economic, the ethical, and other implications. So not people who speak about technology as such or technology developments as such, but who as is our interest, to also sort of illuminate the impacts around them in all the different directions. And well, yes, I think we couldn't really think of anybody better than to start this series than Dr. Joss Moorkens from the University of the Dublin City University. Joss is probably known to many of you, but I would like to say it anyway. We are very pleased, Joss, that you have agreed to be our first speaker in this series. So Joss is Associate Professor at SALIS, at the School of Applied Languages and Intercultural Studies at Dublin City University. And of course, Joss is also a chair of the MA Translation Program, which is also known to many of us at the well-known Center for, I think your center is the Center for Translation and Textual Studies, very similar. Joss is also linked to the ADAPT Center, which is run by Dublin City University and others, to, of course, look at very similar questions to what I have just outlined here, even broader than only, so to say, in translation studies. But so this is also a center that we feel is very closely related to the work we are interested in here. So that also fits very well. Joss is known to you as a very prolific writer. on, of course, quality in translation, including machine translation, on the use of data, because of course this is one of our topics here, also this whole datafication of society and the implications of that. And of course, Joss has written on ethics and machine translation, and that's also, as you have seen, the topic of today. Neural machine translation is a great way to start, I think, our speaker series, but the even greater way to start with it is to look at the ethical questions that this exciting new technology poses. I've said enough. Joss, again, thank you very much. Great to see you here, and I really look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Sabina. And thank you very much to Konstantin and to the other colleagues at CTS, Anna, Felix, Elena, Joanna, who I've worked closely with over the years in lots of different ways, for inviting me along. It's a real pleasure to renew the links between Dublin and Surrey. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about ethics in neural machine translation over the next 45 minutes or so. As we know, neural MT, as Sabina said, it can facilitate communication in a way that surpasses previous MT paradigms, but there are also consequences of its use, and I want to think about those a little bit today. Not necessarily in a way that's anti-machine translation, but just to do with employing or implementing it in the right way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics, introducing ethics in technology. It might be a little bit basic, but just so that we're on the same page. A little bit about ethics in NMT system development, ethics in NMT and professional workflows, and about sustainability and diversity. And I've written with my colleagues who are now in CTS and with others over the last 5 or 6 years about ethics and translation. But what I'm going to talk about today comes from a chapter that is part of a project called Multi-Train MT, led by the Autonomous University of Barcelona. My colleague in Dublin, Dorothy Kenny, is editing a textbook, and my chapter is specifically about ethics in NMT. So it was an opportunity to synthesize and summarize a lot of the research that's been done recently. So that's what today's talk will be based on. So at the very basic level, ethics is a study of what's good or bad, right or wrong. And the idea of the good life was introduced by Socrates, or at least his reported speech by Plato, about when he was being condemned to death. The most important thing is not life, but the good life. So the idea of a life that's worthy of admiration, of not just acceptable, but excellent, is sort of at the basis of ethics. Of course, there was writing about ethics beforehand. Aristotle made this a little bit more concrete when talking about, I must just check in chat here to make sure I'm not missing anything important. To make these a little bit more concrete, Aristotle talked about a set of virtues that, if practiced, would allow human beings to flourish, but they're still quite abstract. Subsequently, philosophers and ethicists have tried to decide or suggest ways that to decide on a moral or right course of action based on whether it has the probability of providing the right result for the majority, the sort of utilitarian idea of weighing up consequences, or by acting on good or pure motives, as Kant has written about. But the problem is that what's well motivated or produce the happiest result for one group won't necessarily produce an equally positive result for another. So there's a tension between the idea that an action can be universally good and moral, such as upholding justice or truthfulness, or the position that values will differ depending on the group or person under examination. So to try and guide how we should act in a given situation, there's been more and more work in applied ethics. So there's this differentiation between theoretical ethics, which asks what's the best theory of the good life, and applied ethics that asks how should we act in this or that situation based upon our best theories of ethics. So what I'll be talking about today is drawing on a number of different areas of applied ethics. So data ethics, business ethics, machine, computer, information ethics. So often this involves a set of codes, and if these codes or set of behaviors, recommended behaviors, are too narrow and too rigidly defined, well, that will mean that in different situations, perhaps they won't work so well. If they're too broad, then they're not really helpful at all. So it can be quite a difficult task to try and have a set of guidelines that will act. But it's a growing area of interest, particularly to do with technology. There's a growing consensus about the importance of ethics in technology, and technology increasingly shapes how we seek the good life with what degree of success. And there's an assumption sometimes expressed that technology is ethically neutral, but increasingly philosophers of science, people from science and technology studies will put forward the idea that technology will reflect the values of the designer, that these values govern the problem addressed by the technology, the decision to create it in the first place, the method of implementation, its intended uses, the reference or training data used, the processing of that data, where the data is stored, the limits to access. So lots of things will be decided. Langdon Winner, as far back as 1983, as reported by Maeve Olahan and by Elena, said that technologies aren't ethically neutral, but engender a sort of a world around the technology. And Kranzberg, in his laws, Kranzberg's laws of technology, said that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Andrew Feenberg has written about this. So they reveal and shape what humans think or value as good. So the reason to talk about this now is really because of the speed and scale and pervasiveness of technology, and the fact that policy and law is inevitably at least one step behind. And that's something that's quite topical as today there was, which I'll refer to a little later, we had the announcement of the draft regulations for the EU on artificial intelligence. Myself and Anna have been discussing these over the last few days over WhatsApp. So particularly in technology, particularly in translation and interpreting, we're really at the forefront of the impact of these technologies. We're probably more technologized than in many other industries, in many other areas. And we're finding that 21st century technologies are reshaping the global distribution of power, justice, responsibility. And similarly to the famous William Gibson quote about the future being here, but not evenly distributed, positive and negative impacts are often, unevenly distributed. So the question is, how do we ensure that access to the enormous benefits promised by new technologies and exposure to their risks are distributed in the right way? And who decides what the right way is? But there are enormous benefits, and I want to make sure that that's clear at the very outset. So particularly related to translation, there's a huge growth in the production of digital data. There's more to be translated than it's possible for human translators to get through. So there's a necessity. Plus, there's lots that, for reasons of risk, for reasons of perishability, that we wouldn't want humans to translate in the first place. So there's a place for machine and for human translation. There's more types of data that's gathered in translation than ever before. And we're finding in translation and in other areas that big data is driving new businesses and new processes. So from my perspective, the consideration of ethics can help with decision making, but also may present opportunities, because more big companies, more translation companies are beginning to think about ethics, or have to think about ethics. And I know there's lots here who have links with Anthony Pym. He's been, from 2013, he talked about the importance of learning to trust and mistrust data, and that sort of literacy is really, really key. So the types of data that are collected in translation, well, we've had bilingual translation data that's been collected since the 80s and 90s, and especially since the advent of translation memory tools, but also timing data. How long did it take to translate a segment or a document? How long was the user active on this task? So having that sort of timing data too. Keystrokes, mouse clicks. So the sort of things that researchers in translation process research have been collecting since the mid-90s using the likes of Translog. These are commonly collected now within tools. Translation quality evaluation information, some of it in real time, some retrospectively, but it's still collected to do with a translation job. Response times, especially within platforms where prospective workers have to respond within a certain time to access a job. Adherence to instructions, to deadlines, demographic data, and of course that demographic data can be linked can be aggregated with other data about a person to make inferences, and that's something I'll come to in a few moments. So I want today to be a little bit interactive. I wasn't sure whether it would be a good idea to try and use the likes of Slido or to try and ask people to speak, but I think I'll use Slido. So if you go to slido.com and put in the hashtag CTS, or you can go directly to a link, which I will now attempt to share in the chat. So I'm going to share this with everyone, and hopefully that's the right link. And I'll make this word cloud poll active. So I want you to respond with the sort of issues you see for translator A in this mocked up case study. So this is a sort of a combination of lots of different things that individual translators and companies have spoken to me about that they've experienced. It's not a case study of one specific person, but I'll read through it. So translator A, in this instance, has freely signed a contract with their regular employer to carry out a translation on a freelance basis using a proprietary web-based platform, giving explicit permission for their translation data to be reused for MT training. The employer trains MT systems using the data from translator A and others. In time, NMT quality improves for translator A's language pair to the extent that the company moves its translation work to post-editing and imposes a unilateral 30% discount on their per-word payment rate. This discount is applied on the basis that productivity has generally improved by roughly 30%, visible to the company from the translation activity data gathered via the translation platform. In order to raise revenue, the company decides to sell MT services externally, and this includes some work for an arms manufacturer. So could you please just enter a word or phrase that you might think of when you read through this, issues that you see in this case study of translator A? And it should crop up on this slide. Taking advantage of IP. Yeah, absolutely. So intellectual property, exploitation of human input, redundancy, intellectual property, absolutely. Conflicted, unethical, translator rights, absolutely. Ethical arms industry. Yeah, that's a big red flag. Of course, they might be a big supporter of the arms industry, but it's not really an opportunity for translator A to decide what happens to their work afterwards. Explicit permission, very important. So at the moment, it's unusual to be able to give explicit permission for how your work will be reused afterwards. There are multiple challenges, absolutely. Consent to use data, not asking for permission. Move my window here so I can see more. Conflicted calculation of the 30%. Yeah, absolutely. So the calculation of the 30%, there was a presentation by, who was it? It was CSA Research anyway at Translating at the Computer a couple of years ago, where they said that in general, they find that post-editing is priced at 60 to 65% of the full word rate. But the problem is that if one translation job is done, and then a further job is priced on the basis of the amount of effort that had to be put into post-editing, well, then what happens if the quality is different? And that often happens in practice. So if we look through, it's often that translators have freely signed a contract. The regular employer, the use of employer here is slightly controversial in itself, because in some jurisdictions, if someone works for if they're contracted to work, they're considered to be directly employed and others not. So they're carrying out their translation on a freelance basis using a proprietary web-based platform. And we're finding that there are more and more proprietary web-based platforms that are being used. So that's something that Joanna is doing research on at the moment. And we're working with Gukhan on a PhD project in Surrey on that. And in a CSA research study that was published in early 2020, there was it was incredible to see the number of platforms that the respondents were used to using, at least 5 and some far more, giving explicit permission for translation data to be used for MT training, and the employer trains MT systems using the data from translator A and from others. In time, NMT quality improves for translators A's language pair, so the company moves its translation work to post-editing. And this is almost a direct quote from the chair of RWS, as reported in Slater in 2018, who said that in time he wanted to move all translation work to post-editing. And this imposition of a unilateral 30% discount, ideally the move to work with MT would be consultative, but in many cases it is unilateral. And then in order to raise revenue, the company decides to sell MT services externally, and this includes some work for an arms manufacturer. So at the moment, there's no real way of seeing how your work will be used after you complete it. And as we know within universities, there's been, especially post-GDPR, for those of us that are affected by GDPR, we usually give the right for someone to withdraw their consent to be involved in a study even after the fact, and we'll remove their data. But of course, once it's anonymized, then it's impossible to identify and to remove their data. So trying to make this decision to, if someone says, well, I don't want my work to be reused for an arms manufacturer, how could you possibly implement that? Okay, thank you very much for your comments on translator A. One more. So this is translator B. So I will just set the poll going. So translator B is opposed to MT as a matter of principle. Not that unusual. B accepts work for a company that expects translators to submit their translation memory with translated target text, which they will repurpose for future human translation. Translator B isn't aware that the work has been automatically assigned by an automated project management system, but there's no translation brief and no direct communication with the company. Translator B is also not aware that the company will soon be acquired by a large conglomerate who will use all available data for MT training and offer it for sale. The data should have all personal information removed before being shared, but this information is retained by accident when the data is uploaded to one purchaser. The company tries to keep this quiet so as to avoid liability. So, some comments on that, please, if you can think of what issues you see there. For translator B, perhaps I should leave this up for a couple more moments. So some similar issues to the previous case study, but some things are a little bit different. Not that unusual for a translator to be opposed to MT. Some see that it's against translators' best interests, but we usually assume that there's a degree of collegiality at work where translators don't really mind work being used for future human translation. So issues you see for translator B. And it should be at the same URL. Knowledge ownership, legal implications, absolutely. There should really be legal implications if there's a data breach. The problem with and GDPR, absolutely. The problem with data breaches is that if a company reported a data breach, that would mean that they'd be seen positively, but they tend to find that it's not great. The public response is usually quite negative. Shareholders see it negatively. There might be a drop in shareholder price if it's a publicly owned company. And there's also those GDPR fines of 4% of annual turnover, or 20 million, whichever is the greater. So privacy, data breach, absolutely. Authorship of data, intellectual property, knowledge ownership, a sad joke. Lack of communication, absolutely, yeah. Deception, liability, unprofessional all around. So if we look back at the examples here, so it's reasonably common. Well, not that common, but it's a practice that work is automatically assigned by an automated project management system. One of our former PhD students leads the team for the automatic assignment of work and automatic project management within Lionbridge, based in Warsaw. And I'm told it's not working that particularly well at the moment, because it's meant to be for very straightforward translation jobs, but inevitably she ends up having to step in as project manager. But this is something that's being worked towards, and it's quite common that there's no translation brief. And as mentioned in work by Christina Abdallah, often translation production networks are quite linear, which means that from one end where there's a translator, there's often no communication that goes all the way back to the end client. Interestingly, as part of the proposal for regulation on the European approach for artificial intelligence that was announced just today, recital 36 of the proposed regulation says that AI systems used in employment, worker management, and access to self-employment, notably for the recruitment and selection of persons, for making decisions on promotion and termination, and for task allocation, monitoring, or evaluation of persons in work-related contractual relationships, should also be classified as high risk, since those systems may appreciably impact future career prospects and livelihood of these persons. So that puts something of a spanner in the works for these sort of automated project management systems. But there are usually safeguards for what they define as high risk. But in these cases, it's down to self-assessment by the provider rather than the involvement of a notified body. Also, interestingly, as of March 9th in Spain, the Government Agreement on Labour Rights says that there's now the presumption of employment in the case of someone doing contract work or working via crowdsourcing, but also they've put in a stipulation for algorithm transparency that makes it mandatory for platforms to inform workers' legal representatives about the mathematical or algorithmic formula determining their working conditions. Of course, difficult to put into practice, as algorithmic explanation is a whole area of itself. It's very common that companies are acquired within translation and interpreting. Graham from Deloitte at the ATC Language Industry Summit in London in 2019 said that in the previous 3 years, there'd been 82 acquisitions of translation and interpreting companies, 31 of those cross-border. And we've seen recently the acquisition of by RWS of SDL, of Iconic Translation Machines within DCU. Kantan MT has been bought by Keywords International, SDI Media, and Iuno Media in the AVT space. And I've talked about the reasons why companies might try to keep information quiet to avoid liability. And we've seen examples of companies being caught out in this sort of respect. So lots here. Thank you very much for your interaction. So some topics to consider in ethical problems related to MT systems training. So one is data ownership, as identified within the word cloud there by some of you contributing. The commonly used metaphor of data as oil gives the impression that data is naturally occurring, whereas in reality it is of course created by humans. And the exponential growth in data in recent years means that there's more data available for MT training than ever before. Of course, there's some shared repositories like the DGT data that can be reused and disseminated free of charge. But the basis for the sharing or the ownership of data in translation and in authorship is down to the Berne Convention, first enacted in 1886, that forms the legal basis and stipulates that translation is a derivative work that is protected as an original work, but without prejudice to the copyright the original author. So meaning that the main copyright accrues to the original author and the translation itself is seen as derivative. In the Bird and Bird report that was commissioned by the European Commission and published in 2014, Trussell and de Bush believe that an argument can be made for originality in a creative translation, although this hasn't been tested in courts. But they also believe that the rights to a translation memory database may be asserted where there's substantial effort put into the obtaining, verification, management, or presentation of the contents, according to the European Database Directive. So, of course, within those jurisdictions affected by the Database Directive. But in practice, the precedent is usually that a translation memory is handed over to the employer, and even whether or not there's a contractual agreement that waives any claim of ownership on the part of a translator. Some translators do hold on to TMs and do use them, even though they're not strictly supposed to do so. And at scale, we've seen that big translation data has become a very valuable resource. When initially there was the first articles about data sharing in 2000, there was an article by Suzanne Topping in Multilingual magazine where she was talking about translators. Only translators think it's ethical to share translation data. Well, that seems quite quaint these days, whereas now data is generally shared by companies. It's become a very valuable resource for machine learning system training, even beyond MT. But that doesn't necessarily mean that translators receive any secondary payment. And due to the granular nature of reuse of data in MT training, it would be very hard to trace the contribution of an individual translator. And that's also true of data that's gathered by web crawling for parallel texts. There's no real attribution of ownership. And we've seen reports of companies with massive valuations that their main job is to stockpile large amounts of parallel data. And I think myself and Dave Lewis have made the point in the past that we would argue that a more equitable system of data ownership would contribute to the sustainability of the translation industry. However, it's quite difficult to try and enact those. We put forward an idea for using the Hess and Ostrom model of having a sort of a group-owned commons that could be shared or added to or utilized at different levels. But because data by its nature is multiple and is so easily copied, it's really difficult to enact that sort of restriction. Permission to use data is another topic that came up in the word cloud. So I talked about the degree of collegiality at play we're assuming among translators who favor resource sharing, but there's a bit less acceptance of training for machine translation, and some believe it's not in the best interest of translators. It's very rare for translators to have any control over how their work is reused, but often the contracts will stipulate that they'll be used for MT training. But it does mean that translators A and B will contribute towards future projects, the ethics and the purpose and end use of which will be opaque to them. And translator A may be ethically opposed to contributing towards arms manufacturing, but they won't have any say in the matter. There are some questions that were put forward by Joseph Weissenbaum in 1986 that were reprinted by Shoshana Zuboff in her book about surveillance capitalism, that she felt that people who contribute towards large technology projects should have the opportunity to ask the questions: what is the final application and use of the products of my work? Am I content or ashamed to have contributed to this use? And that's not something that our translators have the opportunity to ask. And as I mentioned, with metadata being removed for reasons of anonymization, it can be difficult to remove individuals' data, but also it's historically common since the move to statistical machine translation. It's common to remove any metadata from MT training so that only parallel sentence pairs are used. So that means that the identifying metadata has been removed even before GDPR became a consideration. Data distribution. So I mentioned that there's wide scale sharing of data between, bilaterally between companies. There's if something has been created as a public service and paid for by the public, then it's often shared. There might be different licensing agreements that allow it to be shared via projects such as Opus, the Jörg Tiedemann portal for sharing translation data. But we're seeing more and more of these mergers and acquisitions, and one company being acquired by another will mean that the data will be acquired also. It's of value, and it's perfectly legal as long as the data can't be classed as personal data, in which case restrictions would apply. So that means that if it's personal data, then there's a privacy concern, and if data can render an individual identifiable, then they can be considered personal data and are covered by GDPR and by other protections. And companies should, of course, report any data breach. And as I said, there's been many reports of breaches being covered up. Once personal attributes have been removed and the data is anonymized, then personal data becomes just data and is shareable. But even without that metadata, some data may be recognizable, and as an individual or as a group can be aggregated with other data about the group or at the person, and may not be covered by GDPR if it's inferring certain protected attributes, even if it's not, because it's not explicitly in the data. So, for example, translators A and B could have their translation data aggregated with other personal data to make inferences about them individually or as a group that might affect their future chances of employment. And finally, down to the automating of employment decisions or communication, as is the case with the project management of example of translator B. There was a talk recently by Alex Wood, who works a lot on crowdsourcing in the University of Birmingham. And he was noting that what we see happening in crowdsourcing on crowdsourcing platforms, it's proving to be a sort of test bed for moving into other areas. And we're seeing that happening in translation, that there's more and more enumerating of quality of translation work. And there's more and more automation of different steps within the translation process. And what Alex Wood has found is particularly feedback can be very sort of risky and controversial. So if within crowdsourcing platforms, if you receive very poor feedback, then the person who receives poor feedback will get less work and might find that they don't get jobs for a number of months. And that could potentially happen with if there's more enumeration or publicly shared, more broadly shared evaluation of translation. And there's a couple of attempts at the moment to have a sort of score attributed to translation, a quality score that will be applied to translators or given to translators and included in, for example, their account on pros.com. So there was a presentation given about this last year at a conference I was at in Hamburg. And so what this could mean is that if someone's translation is considered poor, or if they're ill and don't produce their best work, or maybe there's a bereavement and for one reason or another they don't produce their best work, that might have an effect on their future employment opportunities. If the decision to employ or not to employ is made out algorithmically, and there's no trust relationship that's been built up, and the relationship is purely transactional, then there will be no opportunity to explain choices or to explain why work is of a certain quality. It's a number is attributed to it, a value is attributed to it, and that's that. And there's it doesn't go any further than this one point of decision. So it could be quite risky having these sort of employment decisions automated. And there was one more thing I wanted to talk about to do with that, but maybe I'll come to that a little bit later. But the use of MT in professional workflows, I'm moving a little slower than I intended to. So in our examples, the examples I put forward, there's a number of different stakeholders, but primarily the translator and the translation agency. I mentioned that ideally the introduction of MT into a workflow would be consultative and agreed not just by those stakeholders, but by others as well. So, for example, the client might see they're reliant on the company to give them good advice. They see that there's a possible saving to be made by using machine translation, but might not consider the translation risks. So those have been identified by Canfora and Oppmann as at the lower end of communication becoming impaired or impossible, loss of reputation, and then going up financial damage, legal consequences, damage to property, and injury or death. And so these are the consequences they identified of mistranslation. And they've also written specifically about neural machine translation in a contribution to the special issue that myself and Felix and Dorothy Kenny co-edited last year. So the client and the end user need to be aware of those risks. The end user is reliant on the client to provide them with text that don't expose them to unexpected risk. But in addition, as Anthony Pym pointed out in 2012, even when a low risk target text is made less comprehensible by post-editing poor quality MT, the translation might conform to the needs of the client, who reduces costs by applying light or full post-editing. But that extra effort is then pushed onto the end reader, who has to comprehend that final result. So we've got lots of people who are involved here. There's the shareholders, and if there's a problem with the output, or if they're exposed to risk, that might affect the value of their shares. There's the end user, the translator, but also the tool developer. So they've got a key role. So I talked about earlier the idea of translation, or of technology development not being neutral. And this is very much relevant to tool developers. So a tool can focus on usability. It can incorporate familiar keyboard shortcuts. It can provide an uncluttered interface. It can maximize customizability. It can make very transparent what activity data it collects, if any, or it can do none of those things. And we're seeing more and more variability within the translation industry, where increasingly companies that create their own platforms to be able to control the data and to control the relationship with translators and what's used within the translation environment, are creating tools, some of which are very user focused, others less so. And there was a paper recently, or a chapter rather, from 2017 that suggested by Gursa and I can't remember the other author, but it's in my list at the end, that suggested that the move to agile project management for translation development is key to the loss of privacy and to data collection, because essentially where there used to be one transaction, one relationship, one point of contact with the company when you buy the software, possibly shrink wrapped in a package, a physical object. Now it's an ongoing relationship because the tool is increasingly deployed over the internet. It's software as a service, so often most of the processing takes place remotely on a server farm or in a co-location facility. But because the relationship is ongoing, that means there's a constant opportunity to renew and to access data. And so rather than having this single transactional point where the relationship begins and ends, now it's an ongoing relationship, and it means that there's a constant data flow. And from the work that Anna Gerberoff did in Dublin, we're aware, for example, with Microsoft Word, the telemetry data that goes back and forth that isn't meant to identify any individual, but gives Microsoft an idea of the amount of work that's being done within their platform. And I know, for example, within DCU, our licenses now for Microsoft 365 means that DCU's IT department can look at how much work is done within Microsoft Office platforms, and they've got a sort of what would you call it, a display where they can see how much we type, how much we contribute, and can actually identify it to the granular level of an individual. So there's a lot that can be varied within tool development. Telemetry is included in SDL Stratos Studio, for example, that will now become RWS Stratos Studio. For translators, there's many that aren't aware of the variable ways that MT may be used within professional workflows. The decision to accept or not to accept a job might be difficult, particularly if the agency hasn't been transparent, as we've seen in these examples. And for translators, there are often codes of ethics that are provided, but those really are intended to be reassuring for purchasers of translation, not really to help translators with their decision making. So there's a place for translators organizations to help in an advisory capacity here. The use of MT in translation production doesn't necessarily entail a loss of quality, and the cost and effort of human translation isn't appropriate for all types of texts, particularly those with short shelf life and those that present little risk. But for critical texts in which a mistranslation will introduce risk, the use of MT has to be considered carefully and has to be subject to review. And all stakeholders really should be made aware of that. And that's where we introduce liability. Translators might be found to be in breach of contract due to negligence or failing in their duty of care to a client. A liability can only refer to human behavior, and that's something that was reiterated in the new AI guidelines that appeared today, which means that a person or a body or a company must bear responsibility for an injury or a loss related to an error that's introduced by MT in the translation process. And in terms of confidentiality, there have been instances where confidential and sensitive material has been made available through unthinking use of free online MT. So I'm thinking of the example from Norway where there was HR data that was unwittingly shared. So moving on to the idea of sustainability. So there are considerations to do with sustainability in lots of different industries, but in translation, the impact is really underway for a couple of different reasons. One is that MT post-editing has been the fastest growing area of translation according to CSA research since 2010, predating the shift from statistical to neural MT. But also the largely freelance workforce means that translators have flexibility and autonomy, but work on a project by project time frame and are uniquely vulnerable in that way. So there's a growing consensus that AI will have a major effect on many areas of work previously thought to be immune from automation, but translation is one where it's really at the forefront. As the pace of mergers and acquisitions has increased, creating large publicly traded translation conglomerates, the disconnect between those making decisions on business operations and freelance workers that are doing the translation, this disconnect really has grown. And there are more and more very narrowly defined roles of translators or freelance workers doing translation, post-editing, revision, annotation, review, subtitling. And we've seen in a review that myself and Marta Rocky published last year that the translation industry hasn't really historically shown strong leadership on ethics and sustainability. So while ideally technology would either add things that automate things that weren't being done before, or at the very least would augment translators, as suggested in the work by Martin Kay and his proper place of men and machines in translation from 1980. What we're also seeing in a lot of instances is the work of the translators being gradually circumscribed. So this might include just repeatedly doing quality checks or annotation or correcting repetitive errors in mixed quality MT output that might even be decomposed down to the sentence level without context. So while some translators do enjoy post-editing, even with discounts applied, it's the work, there has to be a balance between the long and short-term benefits for all stakeholders. And translators have to, just being paid well, in which case, and often they're not, money isn't the only motivating factor. So looking at work on job satisfaction and on motivation, workers find satisfaction in working on something that has meaning. in mastering their task, in working with supportive colleagues. They're motivated by self-efficacy, by a sense of achievement, of recognition for that achievement. And if this isn't a consideration in translation production, then the better workers will leave. They're smart people, and there'll be a shortage of skilled translators and post editors. So this sort of broader idea of sustainability, the social sustainability, needs to be more of a consideration in the translation industry. And it's something that we see in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They include as SDG 8 the importance of providing decent work and economic growth. Although some might suggest that environmental sustainability isn't something that really fits with economic growth, but that's something that I won't really get into here. But in terms of environmental concerns, the ICT industry, as pointed out by Michael Cronin in 2017, MT relies on the IT industry, which requires the mining of rare metals and has a reputation for poor recycling and for polluting. But also, as evidenced by a widely read paper by Emma Strubel and others from 2019, Neural MT is particularly resource intensive. It requires powerful graphical processing units for training and large amounts of power. And they estimated that for one large transformer neural network model, the training of that will produce almost 5 times the CO2 output of a car, including fuel, during the lifetime of those cars. And only the largest companies can afford the cost of training such large-scale models. So while there's constant optimization that might bring down the requirements of power consumption, we're seeing that the language models that are being used for training are getting bigger. So it remains the case that training an NMT system is costly and requires a good deal of power, even though most of them won't be anywhere near as large as the example by Strubel and others. And there's currently no agreed benchmark for publishing power consumption as part of writing on MT system development. And I'm getting short of time, so I don't know, should I try and finish up, or am I okay for a few more minutes, Sabina?
No, I think you are okay for a few minutes. I hope so. To carry on. Yeah, sure.
Well, I'll finish within the next 5 minutes, so apologies for going on at length. But I want to talk a little bit about diversity. So related to this idea of sustainability and the fact that that development of NMT systems is so costly, cost and power requirements, they're a huge barrier to entry for NMT system development. The initial published work on NMT was conducted mostly by well-resourced academic research groups in North America and in Europe. But what we're seeing is that large technology companies have thrown their weight behind research efforts in NMT. So increasingly, that the main breakthroughs are being made through by these large tech company research groups. If, for example, you look at the results for the WMT shared tasks on machine translation year on year, in 2016, 2017, the top results for the large language pairs, such as English, German, were usually produced by university research groups from Edinburgh, from DCU. But within the last couple of years, it's Google, it's Facebook, it's Microsoft, because they've got well-resourced teams, they can pay developers better, they've access to more data, and increasingly it's impossible for research groups to compete. But and that's meant that certainly in DCU, we focused our attention more on minority and low resource languages, and the ability to create synthetic data by back translating monolingual data has led to a jump in quality for under-resourced language pairs. So we're seeing a bit more diversity in the output, but we're not seeing that same diversity in research groups. And although there's been no survey of diversity in research teams, and there has been research published on MT using simplified Chinese, Bengali, Hindi, languages with huge numbers of speakers, but non-European and historically under-resourced. But there have been more and more discussions of bias to do with those tech companies, particularly in the case of Timnit Gebru recently and others from the Google groups, and well-publicized errors and blind spots. And that's required attempts to de-bias the output from the likes of the GPT-3 text production network. In their article on the societal impact from MT, Lucas Nunes Vieira, Minako O'Hagan, and Carol O'Sullivan found that the inappropriate use of MT can cause harm to vulnerable people in medical and legal use cases. And they find that it can exacerbate inequality stemming from a disproportionate availability of data and resources for a relatively small number of the world's languages, combined with a lack of MT literacy. So, the problem, I suppose, as well with the fact that MT outputs will have the bias that comes from the training data, and there is this sort of hegemonic relationships between the well-resourced and less well-resourced languages. Historically, information flows from well-resourced to poorly resourced languages, and there's a concern that was expressed by Antonio Toral and others that poorly resourced languages will be impoverished in the long run. But it could be the case for all languages for which a lot of material produced is machine translated. So Eva van Massenhove and Dimitar Sterionov and Andy Way wrote about how lexical diversity is lost in NMT output. Eva van Massenhove has written a lot about algorithmic bias exacerbating existing gender bias in training data, where the agreement with a noun or verb is most common with one or another gender. And it's something that we continually see examples posted on Twitter about in Finnish or in French, where there's biased output. And at the moment, there's an attempt to employ computers as implicit ethical agents. So essentially what that means is that the computers or the output is programmed to de-bias. There's been efforts by Google to, rather than just having a single gender attribute for certain words, by including both in the training data. But continually we're finding that or maybe certain protected terms can't be searched for or can't be used. But we continually find that people find ways around that, and that systems will automatically produce biased data. I'm not sure that having computers as explicit ethical agents where the computer actually is meant to more intelligently make that decision is going to be the answer there either. So the diversity of developers and users would be one way to try and weed out some of these problems in biased output. So coming towards the end, as MT quality improves, it has facilitated more communication and continues to do so. And I think it's important to reiterate that there is a place for MT. Ethical concerns, it's important that they're considered by MT developers, by translation buyers, by translation agencies, translators, and consumers of translation. And ethical considerations should be a matter of course in MT development, as opposed to just a nice to have, an add-on at the end. So when working with and using MT, it's important for developers, for users, for researchers to consider the fit with our values, with our purposes, and with our principles. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time. And I have a number of references here at the end in case they're of any use for you. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I've seen a little bit of action in the chat, so I'll try and catch up on that now.
Yes, while you are reading this, thank you very much for such a rich talk. So very interesting. Yes, I think we give you the opportunity to look whether there were questions. The first ones were all hello. Anna Gerberov has a question. Anna, are you still here? Do you want to elaborate on your question?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Joss. Hello, Salini. Thank you, Joss, for a wonderful talk. It wasn't really a question, but when you were posing to us the translator B case, I was just thinking that all the things that we said that were wrong, yes, but also that this translator B does not work in a vacuum, right? He, in turn, might have used internet in various ways, using somebody else's data without being aware that maybe he is also, he's against MT, but he might use Lingui, or he or she, they my usage. That was more of a reflection, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose it's rare that someone's entirely translating from scratch with no help from technology these days. And I'm offering no judgment as to whether translator B should be happy enough to use MT or should be very pro MT. But it just is the case that there's it's often the case where leverage is accepted up to the point where it's MT, and then the leverage isn't accepted. And perhaps you could say that that's a little arbitrary, but it is something that we often find when talking to translators. I suppose maybe it's the initial impetus for MT, the fact that it was to create seamless communication as opposed to being an instrumentalist tool like the likes of translation memory is. So maybe that's in the back of their minds, but certainly it brings the hackles up with some translators.
Yeah, I think that the responsibilities, it also relies on the translator, that we should all be more aware in general that data that we use all the time is created by somebody, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there's also the disparity of power. That means, if that data is employed in an empowering way, maybe it's easier to think that way, to be a little bit more open-minded about it. But if you're finding that your work is rigidly defined and repetitive, perhaps there's less cause to be open-minded about leveraging other work via technology, including MT. Do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a power relation as well with the data. Yeah, it's not easy.
No.
Not easy to be ethical, even when you're sitting in your own, looking at data from other people. But at least the labeling things in the proper way can help for everyone to be aware where things are coming from, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a point in the chat we contributed recently that you were very clear about, that labeling is important, and I absolutely agree. From Neil Coulson, my question: history demonstrates that ethical concerns about, for example, using personality typing, Myers-Briggs, Big Five, etc., in business seem in practice to be overwhelmed by commercial interests and used anyway. Do you think a similar kind of overwhelming will happen in regard to machine translation and all of its potential warts? Well, I mean, it is being used anyway, but and it probably is being pushed into use cases where it isn't really ideal. But there needs to be some sort of pushback from translators against the unethical use of machine translation or inappropriate use of machine translation. If the draft proposals for AI that were put forward today are brought in, well, that will have a pushback effect as well. But also, if these risks come to pass, if there are injuries, if there are deaths, if liabilities mean that it hits shareholder value, or it means that there's a loss, there's no return of investment in implementing MT, well, that will make a difference as well. So, or if at the moment the stories of people leaving the translation industry are very much anecdotal, but if it becomes difficult to get people to do certain types of work in the translation industry, well, that will have an effect as well. But we're not really seeing that rebalancing happening at the moment, and maybe there's a tipping point that we're coming towards. But also, there was something that cropped up recently when I was talking to Renée Desjardins about her book about social media translation, and she was saying that her book was overwhelmingly positive, and if she was to write that today, that the book would be quite different, because even in the intervening 3 or 4 years since it was published, we've become a lot more critical about technology. And in the media, we're seeing a lot more critical discussion of technology. So perhaps there's the time is coming when we'll look at these things in a more critical way.
So Neil has also commented, Jellicoe, we come back to your question. Neil has also commented on the death by mistranslation. Yes, indeed, that's probably a possibility. I think this is a really interesting discussion. Can I just add this phenomenon? Of course, that translators, interpreters are leaving the job. I mean, we have seen that in the UK with a much more traditional technology in legal interpreting, where the technology also wasn't the reason, but the whole sort of way legal interpreters have been outsourced by the government, deterioration of all the working conditions, and that was overlaid, or the one has overlaid the other here, with the increasing, of course, also technology use, communication use, remote interpreting use. So this is then also influenced by other things. I've seen that in other countries, the use of remote interpreting has been received quite differently, much more positively, because it didn't coincide. That's the word I was looking for. It didn't necessarily coincide with the whole wave of outsourcing as well. So, I mean, if you see that then also in the other parts of the environmental context where this is going on, I don't think that is sort of all too unlikely. And we are, as I said, already seeing that in other areas that this is happening. Yes, there's people who so several legal interpreters, well qualified legal interpreters, do not work for the court system anymore because of all this outsourcing, and then the whole other things that are happening there. Yes. So that was just a remark from a slightly different sort of technology use and associated issues. But maybe back to maybe back to Neil's comment on the. And also Jellicoe had another comment. Jellicoe, you want to talk to your question?
Yeah, so just a general comment. As I said, I already have this experience, what Jos talked about, automatization of all the processes, and it's already happening, basically. The MT, the project management, I work with that every day, basically. So for me, as a subtitler and some other creative translations, like literary, where's the question of authorship in the future? I mean, when a machine translates it, coming from as a result of hundreds of different translators contributing. So where's your name in that?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. It's a difficult conundrum, and I think ABT is really at the forefront of this. We're seeing more and more post-editing work, and possibly the work that Anna has done on reception of literature in different translation modalities to replicate that within ABT and see what the results are and reception of the results, the reception for the viewer. Is there a difference in engagement and enjoyment when there's more technology employed? And perhaps that might be helpful in trying to push back a little. And there was something else I was thinking of to do with that. Yeah, the other thing is that there's the use of pivot languages is really common in ABT, and according to the Berne Convention, there should be rights for the translator to decide if there's going to be a further translation based on their translation. So they should be consulted. Perhaps they might will only agree if there are royalties that will accrue to them. And this was put forward on the basis of literature, but use of pivot languages is really common for ABT. So, should there be royalties accruing? And certainly it's not happening at the moment. So that's something else that's in question. And the combination of using purpose-built platforms that don't have all the functionality of the tools that subtitlers, for example, like to use, plus the fact that jobs are being broken down. So if we look at the quick turnaround jobs, that, you know, for example, the example from what was it, Language in the Media from 2018, where Iuno Media were talking about the fast turnaround jobs, where they provide a translation of a premium Korean drama within 2 hours of the initial broadcast, where the program is broken down into 15-minute chunks. You know, presumably there'll be a point at which this work becomes so unsatisfying that it's, you know, enough people don't really want to do it. But I don't think we're really seeing that at the moment, because, you know, people do really want to do audiovisual translation. They really enjoy their media, and that means more people want to get involved. But it's a worryingly flat industry. How do you see it, Selkio?
It might be surprising, but I actually like these changes, because, especially as you mentioned, the pivot languages. Because it's already simplified and reduced, it's easier for the machine to translate. So I basically can translate a whole 45-minute episode from Polish through English in an hour, which I couldn't do before. So for me, definitely, as long as the rates are the same, I can agree with that, definitely. And the company I work for keeps saying, yes, the rates are staying the same. This is to help you because we have a lot of content to translate. So at the moment, yeah, I like the whole process. And what you mentioned also about automatic project management, it's happening. And although they are not saying it openly, I think there's some sort of filtering going on, because the best translators do get jobs all the time, whereas those that don't, or that don't work that often, don't get as many jobs. So it's just interesting to kind of be in the middle of all of that. Yeah.
Well, I think we're definitely seeing that sort of crowdsourcing job distribution happening in AVT, where there are certain people who have the permission to access platforms, and the jobs are posted, and if you don't get back within a certain length of time, you know, then you won't get the work. But I do wonder about how that's managed centrally.
Or even that, that's abandoned now, and you have a central platform where they put all the tasks they have. Whoever sees them at that point can just take them. So it's not offered to any individual translator, but to everybody on the platform. And then whoever comes first gets to actually take the job. Yeah.
And are there reputation results, or are there reputation figures based on quality, or is it just anyone who's on the platform who can access it?
As I said, so there is metrics, and we do get info about that. But they are not saying it. We just can assume that they filter the jobs according to that. So first it gets offered to the best translators, and then if nobody takes it, then it goes down. That's just our assumption. We are not sure. There's no confirmation yet.
Yeah. So that lack of transparency is slightly worrisome as well.
That's problematic, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, on the other hand, as long as conditions are good and the work is enjoyable, then things are okay. But it's a little bit of a worry when the company isn't being transparent about how these jobs are distributed.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting.
Can I add again from an interpreting perspective? There are interesting parallels which I'm always quite eager to tease out. Similar, I mean, the job distribution in interpreting also, you have to be often in legal interpreting, for example. I mean, interpreters are needed fast. One of the big challenges. We've also seen that in some public service institutions that there are systems where basically if you live close by, for example, if you interpret for court or for the police, you get the job. So there is all this, but there's also, of course, discussion. It needs to go wider than, is this a good translator or interpreter, or does that person live close by? And so there are also discussions around, what else are you responsible for here, even if strictly speaking you are not the employer, because of course translation interpreting is it's not a gig industry, but it's largely freelance. So, you know, are you also responsible in keeping everybody sort of in the job, and also by offering people the jobs on a fairer basis? You of course also give people the opportunity to practice, strictly speaking. And so that also all needs to be factored into those models. I'm not sure that is how that happens on these translation platforms with the more or less automated project management. Are people thinking about that? Or is that currently out of these? I mean, it's easy to program a system that distributes the job somehow more or less well or more or less badly. But what other considerations are there? Is that even on the table, that discussion?
So in the general discussions to do with crowdsourcing, not specific translation, there have been examples of companies or clients, people who want work done, and the workers developing a trust relationship via the platform. Some crowdsourcing companies will try and prevent that because it means that they can take the work off platform. Of course, there's a risk to both parties then, because all payment and all communication is moderated via the platform. And if they take it off platform, that introduces a risk to both. But there have been examples of people building trust relationships within a crowdsourcing platform to actually have more than just a transactional relationship. Is that really what you're talking about, Sabina?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I mean, I guess, crowdsourcing, that's such a wide area with different types of job profiles. I think in translation, or rather interpreting, I mean, that's where I can see this. It's, of course, the options are more limited to take this off platform and offline and so, but what I can see there is, or what I wonder is, where comes this responsibility that I think, say, as a public service organization, if you have public service interpreters working for you, maybe that's also a very special case, but they are basically on your approved list, and they have passed exams so that they can actually work for that particular public service institution, be it in healthcare or in the courts or whatever. And but then, I mean, these interpreters then also to some extent rely on it. Of course, they can find other work, but not necessarily that much. So they rely, in fact, on they need to rely on some kind of fair work distribution system, so that it doesn't just happen that if you live close to the court, you get the call because you can come, because that minimizes the travel cost. I mean, that's we've heard of this, but that shouldn't happen. But the other thing is also that, I mean, that there needs to be a wider responsibility, because if you always give the job to the same interpreters, the others have no practice, they have no exposure, they won't they lose their ability in principle to interpret, because they may not have enough opportunities to interpret somewhere else. And and then this goes further. I mean, training, CPD for those people, and so I don't know to what extent these things can be transferred to translation context. We'll probably have to think a bit about this, but I wondered whether anybody is thinking about this in a translation context. It may be quite a specific
to the workers.
Yes, it may be quite a special case, because obviously they are freelance interpreters, but nevertheless they work in a very specialized field. So there are not that many freelance, not employers, but the people who are working with the freelancers, the people who are commissioning them. There are not so many of them. So, that's
this new agreement in Spain that was intended really for the likes of Deliveroo riders, but for people who are doing project-based jobs, it defines them as employees, and therefore the employer has responsibilities to them. I don't know that you could say that training is something that they're legally obliged to do, but there's all the other statutory responsibilities that are related to do with payment of tax, payment of having length, contracts of certain length, what have you. So there are other responsibilities that come into play, and that was something that was controversial in the recent in California recently as well. So that there's certainly a place for legal pushback. The other part of that new Spanish agreement that asks for algorithmic transparency, I'm not sure how well that can work in practice, but in general, I think a contribution of these sort of legislative attempts and groups working together. There's a comment from Carlos about a return to harsher labor relations, but monopolies. That, yeah, I mean, I suppose really, working together and trying to lobby on behalf of the group is going to be increasingly important, and it's something I think the ITI are looking at to try and make sure that their members are well informed about technology, about processes, but also work to mutual benefit and don't take on work that doesn't offer decent pay or decent conditions. It's in the example you're talking about for interpreters. There's a real risk for anyone who puts all of their employment, all of their eggs are in one basket, metaphorically, because then if there's a unilateral change, or even if there's an algorithmic change, that could affect you really badly. So from our program, there's relatively few graduates that become freelance translators, but those that do, we certainly try to encourage them to try and have a number of different companies that they work with, rather than sticking with just one or two, because it puts them in a uniquely vulnerable position.
Josh, could I come in as a segue on the little comments that I put you?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand what you meant by it, Carlos. Apologies. So yeah, please go ahead.
No problem. It was telegraphic. I wanted to, if it was possible, to take 1 short minute to go through it. Mm-hmm. I work as a translator, as a certified translator, certified terminologist, and certified writer, and I teach in 3 universities, which I'm following on a word that you mentioned, diversification. You mentioned the employers being diversified. More and more in Canada, we're talking about terminologists. This is a word that we haven't heard in the whole session. Terminologists as being communication agents. I believe, in my personal opinion, terminology is the field where automating has been the most successful, because we don't feel anybody has been pressured, cornered. Actually, everything went well with IATE, Termium, GDT, and whatever. All these databases, I mean, nobody's going to be against them. My concern, and I don't know if we can address that now, my concern is the new generation coming to the market. Initially, when you have a young student coming first year, let's say, he or she is not a translator of texts, he or she is a translator of words and nothing more. And it takes 2-3 years to make them understand that you translate a text. But now what we're doing, we teach them that, and right away after that, we teach them how to become segmentalist translators. So we undo what we've done. And I don't know, well, I think it's actually all over the world, not just in Montreal. There are also companies that I won't name, but that have a total monopoly, which means they will sell you the software, they will have a translation agency in your downtown core, they will force you to slap down your prices, and they will shove down your throat their software at the right price, meaning at the high price. Is anybody in the world, and this is my question too, is anybody in the world gathering steam to organize and fight that? Because there are companies where you actually have to punch in to go to the washroom. We haven't seen that for 30 years, and now it's coming back because of these Flow and whatever other software. Is it normal? Is it acceptable? We talk about it as something totally normal, but is it moral that we have to be in a flow like sheep? I believe in technology. I use a lot of technology, but I do agree that I have my reserves. And when I have to teach technology to my students, I tell them, make darn sure that you have one chance, one fighting chance, not to be a little toy pushed around. You have to punch in to go to the washroom, you have to punch in to go smoke a cigarette if you have to, or whatever. Is this normal? We live through it. I don't know how it is in Europe, but in Canada, we're totally submerged. It used to be an amazing country for translation. It still is if you want to become a segmentalist. If you want to be a translator, pure translator, using tools, but without being like that, it's becoming virtually impossible. Sorry, long question. How is it in Europe in that respect?
All I can talk about is Ireland, where there's a big focus on localization in Ireland, but there's a wide variability in agencies and in translation clients and working conditions. We haven't necessarily seen that sort of surveillance down to the level where, you know, they're looking at how long the toilet breaks are. But the more experienced translators that I speak to, so for example, Annette Schiller, who we work with in DCU, is she's the current chair of Fit Europe, and she's very much against moving to payment by the hour, for example, or having that sort of surveillance of time, because she feels that she's built up her speed over years, and that's her experience. The benefit of her experience is being able to translate more efficiently or faster with the use of technology. So I haven't necessarily seen that there's that sort of that granular surveillance going on, but I don't know that I would necessarily know about it, or that I'm best placed to answer that question. I mean, I wonder if, Felix, for example, you know, you have a translation company. Are you seeing these sort of surveillance tactics actually being employed?
Well, we've been talking about the platforms, right? And the platforms have all of those tools really to segment, define how you work. You're just producing words. Yeah, I think we are moving towards that, and we are, as Carlos was saying, perhaps training our students to be like that. I don't know if there are many opportunities to fight against that, but I'm also not very optimistic about it. But just because you asked me to speak, and we are nearly at pub time, I would say that maybe we should cut this conversation a bit shorter. But I was just going to do a comment. You mentioned distribution of responsibility, that technology brings this distributed responsibility. And sometimes we feel that this means throwing responsibility around, you know, just like in the agile development cycle, in which products are brought to the market earlier, so that the user has the responsibility to bring the feedback for you to correct everything. And we have been talking about MT literacy as well, right? Everybody should be more aware of the effect that machine translation has, because otherwise we are just throwing this responsibility for the errors until someone really gets hurt. And that's when the feedback comes back. Otherwise, we're not thinking about feedback. You know, we're just making everything as fast as we can, and the users do not complain. The readers of the subtitles complain here and there, but we're all producing everything at this rhythm. And yes, these conversations about ethics and diversity, inclusion, they are really necessary as part of this machine translation literacy discussion that we should be having. Right.
There seems to be more of a focus on speed, I think, than ever.
Yeah.
But also, when there's so many people involved in a process, we have the problem of many hands, where it's hard to identify what person is responsible for one individual problem or error. But when there will be an injury, or when there will be a liability to be passed on, someone has to be held liable, whether it's a company or a person. So it can't be a machine.
Mm-hmm.
So that, there's no getting around that.
Very good. Thank you.
I suppose it's 5 o'clock, so that might be a good place to end it, unless you have any other questions or comments, Sabina or Konstantin.
I was about to. I just thought I had seen another comment, but I can't see it now. But I do agree. It would be pub time, so maybe the only other point I wanted to add is there was this question: can we fight? What can we do? Yes, we can try to fight. But I think also to say, I think the task for us here, for as academics, I know there are also thankfully other people here, but our task is also to find evidence and to. I mean, that's also not so easy. I mean, there are different scenarios, and the one size fits all absolutely doesn't work. We have different views, and for us, it's really trying to provide evidence for different scenarios and for what's going on. So, I mean, this is also a fight, I think, that we have to fight in academia, that we get access to those settings where we can collect meaningful research data that we can then offer, so to say, also to the community to see what is something that is acceptable or appropriate or suitable. So we often have to rely on anecdotal evidence. That's not the best kind of evidence. So we also have to, maybe that's another fight. That's the fight we academics have to fight. But that was my plea also to the community to help us with that, because I think we all benefit from that. Maybe on that note, Joss, thank you very much for inspiring us with the talk. And you've seen, I mean, very interesting discussion. I'm convinced that if we were sitting all around the table, the conversation would even go on. And I hope we can do that anytime soon. Some of you may have seen our idea is to get the speaker series going, and hopefully we can welcome you back in a month's time. We plan to have the next speaker, so every month we want to have another installation, so to say, of this lecture series. And we are also planning for this to lead up to a conference, ideally face-to-face in 2022. We will see where we go with it, but that's so I hope that's not the last we have seen of all of you here, and certainly not of you. Just thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you for coming along and for facilitating the talk today. Much appreciated. Thank you for all the interactions. All the best, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, see you soon, everybody. Bye.